My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. We have a good one for you guys today. I'm going to be talking to Dr. Andrew Holycross, and we are going to talk about some of the most fascinating snakes on the planet in arguably one of the most interesting places for snakes, certainly rattlesnakes in North America. And it's an interesting place to me. Where I'm talking about is the desert Southwest and specifically, kind of that Sky Island region between the major mountain ranges in Mexico and the Rocky Mountains. And it's an interesting region for me. As you all know, I did my doctoral work in Idaho with Great Basin rattlesnakes. And when I finished that, I had two opportunities. I could go on and do a postdoc with Wildlife Conservation Society, working in the Northern Rockies and Yellowstone, continuing my work with the Great Basin rattlesnakes. Or my other option was to go down and work on some of these Sky Island rattlesnakes in Arizona. And I obviously ended up staying in the Rockies and ended up, through WCS, creating the Orianne Society and working on indigo snakes and all of these things. So I'm very thankful for how things turned out, but I always was curious how life would have gone if I ended up moving to the Southwest. Anyways, great to have you here today, Andy. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Yeah, no problem. I like to start off with all of my guests and give the audience an idea of how they got into this. And so the first question is going to be that, people like you and I, we're really eccentric to a lot of people, right? In the world, they look at us and they look at people who are interested in snakes, and it's just this thing that's so far outside of the world. So I like to hear that origin story. How did you originally get into snakes? Is this something that's been in you since you were a child, or something that hit you later in life? What's that story?
Absolutely, since childhood. In two words, what got me into snakes is Sir Hiss. And Sir Hiss was my pet garter snake when I was probably 6 or 7 years old. And garter snake I caught in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and kept as a pet. And I don't know what it is. I just, have always been into wildlife and amphibians and reptiles in particular. I had aquariums full of tiger salamanders as a kid that used to fall into our window wells in Cheyenne and get trapped there after the rains. And I've just always been fascinated by that. I got a box of books from my mom about a decade ago. She said, I got all these books from your childhood. Do you want them? I said, yeah, send them down. And they arrived, and it was like 90% of them are, field guides and in a running brook and stuff like that. So I think it's just innate.
That's great. So books that you're still interested in. You probably just put half of them on your shelf.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Great. So you grew up in Wyoming then?
Kind of all over. My dad was in the Air Force, and so, I was born in Toledo, Ohio. We spent a little time in the Philippines that I can't remember. I was 2 years old. Washington State. Most of my grade school years were in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And then most of junior high and high school was in Omaha, Nebraska.
Gotcha. Well, so you grew up with this interest, and you had this pet garter snake that it sounds like helped you kind of continue that inspiration for you. But when was it that you realized, oh, this is something that I could potentially, make a living at. This is something I could become a professional at. Is that something you realized in high school, or something kind of learned when you went off to college, or how did that come together?
I think I drifted kind of away from the biology a little bit. I mean, I grew up in the country in Nebraska, and so I was always kind of close to nature. But in terms of like thinking of it as a career, that really didn't happen until college. I got to college and I thought, oh, I'll be a war correspondent, a journalist, or I thought about being an attorney for a little while. And then I think the second semester of my freshman year, after I got back in college, I was removed from college after my first semester there. I had other things that were priorities at that time. But after I got back in, the second semester after I got back in and came to my senses, I took an introductory biology course, and it was just like a bell went off, and it was like, oh yeah, that's right. And there's people that do make a living at this, and that's what I'm going to do. The second, sort of big moment was, so I changed my major. And the second big moment was towards the end of that undergraduate career. A professor of mine, Dr. Stasiak, hired myself and a friend, Keith Malmos, to do some fish survey work on the Missouri River. And so we got a John boat and a truck, and we just surveyed all up and down the Missouri River for 2 rare minnow species all summer long. And that was it, pardon the pun, but the hook was set. And, it's like, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do field biology. And so I applied to the master's program there. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, where was it you did the undergrad? I missed that.
I started it at University of Nebraska-Lincoln and did all but the last year. The last year I did at University of Nebraska-Omaha. And then I got my master's at University of Nebraska-Omaha, studying prairie rattlesnakes in the sandhills of Nebraska.
Gotcha. Okay. I've never been to the sandhills. Next spring, I am planning a trip there. I'm an avid turkey hunter, and I was going to go check that area out.
Oh, nice.
But maybe I need to combine that with some herping. There must be some other interesting animals there too. So, but we can talk about that offline.
Okay.
But So, and then, so you did your master's on prairie rattlesnakes, and what was the general focus there of that project? Ecology, natural history?
Just interest, ecology and natural history. Yeah. I went on a field trip with Ken Jaluso's mammalogy class, and we went out to Halsey National Forest, which is this weird, planted forest in the middle of the sandhills, and visited a prairie dog colony there, and the rattlesnakes were emerging, and it was like, oh man, rattlesnakes.
That's cool.
That's it. I'm going to do this. And so there hadn't been much done in prairie dog towns on prairie rattlesnakes. And so I spent a summer living in a prairie dog town on some private property out there, and just had a ball. It was wonderful.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So how did your PhD come about? Did you go right from your master's to get the PhD, or is that something that happened, kind of later in life? What was the next step after the master's?
So I was already looking ahead to the PhD while I was working on the master's thesis out in Western Nebraska. And I was, Dave Duvall was a really big name in rattlesnake biology, and particularly with regard to prairie rattlesnakes. And he was right next door in Wyoming. He had a study site there. And so I wanted to work with him. He had moved from Wyoming, University of Wyoming, to Arizona State. And so I went out there and visited him at his field site, and he recruited me to come down to ASU. And I already knew I wanted to work with montane rattlesnakes. And Dave was more interested in atrox at the time. But yeah, so before I even finished the master's, I was admitted to the PhD program at ASU and went down there to work with Dave. It ended up not working out, and I ended up with Mike Douglas as my major advisor and Jack Fouquet as co-advisor.
Mm-hmm. And some of the work for your PhD is on the species we're going to talk about. Is that correct?
Yes. So the dissertation focused on, I think the title's Conservation Biology of 2 Endangered Rattlesnakes, or something close to that. And it focused on the biology of desert Massasauga and New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnakes. both down in the same area, down in the near the boot heel of New Mexico, and the New Mexico ridge nose is up in the mountains, and those desert Massasauga are down in the grassland valleys.
Yeah, great. Well, so let's. That's kind of a good transition. I guess the last thing I'll ask you about is, so how did you, so you finished your PhD, and how did you end up where you are today? And I guess the best way to start that is, where are you today? What is it that you, now that you are Dr. Holycross, what is it that you do for a living, and where is it that you reside? And kind of that next step from the
someplace
PhD.
that I never would have imagined. So after I graduated with the PhD, I applied for teaching jobs, and I got a teaching job at Mesa Community College in Arizona. Taught there for 20 years. I just retired from there this past February. Loved the job. I love teaching, and I taught intro bio primarily. Occasionally, I teach herpetology at ASU. I'm an adjunct at ASU. And but when COVID hit, I started doing a little bit of biological consulting on the side. And so that's what I'm doing right now, is I'm a biological consultant. So I come out and monitor for desert tortoises in the Mojave Desert on construction projects out here. And it's not the most stimulating work in the world, but it pays about 3 times as much as I was making at the community college.
Yeah, to get you outside and
you're outside, yeah.
Yeah, looking
it
for
is fun.
Desert tortoise. That's not a bad day. So
Yep.
Great. Well, have you ever been down here to the southeast and seen our gopher tortoises and that whole system?
I have not. I have not. I was in Alabama as a kid for about 6 months, and during one of my dad's tours. But that's about it. And then I've been in Florida a couple times.
Yeah,
but not a lot in the southeast.
Yeah, well, you have to come down. It's obviously you kind of work and live in one of the reptile and amphibian meccas, but the southeast is certainly the other one. It's a pretty amazing place. So, anyways, well, that's talking about the focus of your dissertation is a good transition, because I want to really spend most of our time today talking about the New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnake, and let's start off with maybe a little more broader context, because this is either a species, a subspecies, a morph type, and I want you to clear that up for us, of a complex of multiple species. So maybe if you could kind of start off, just talk about the ridge-nosed rattlesnakes, kind of what their distribution is, what kind of the taxonomy is, and how people think, how closely or how distantly they think these are related, or again, are they species, are they subspecies? So start with a little context there, if you would.
Yeah, so the Crotalus willardi, the ridge-nosed rattlesnake, is distributed throughout the Sierra Madre Occidental and then up into the Sky Islands. So it makes it into Arizona and New Mexico and just a few mountain ranges. And traditionally, there's been 5 subspecies recognized. The Arizona ridge-nosed rattlesnake is found in the Huachuca Mountains, the Santa Rita Mountains, and the Patagonias in Arizona, as well as the whetstones. And then the New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnake in the United States is found only in the Palencia Mountains and the Animas Mountains. So those are the 2 subspecies that we have stateside. There's also Willardi silus, Willardi amabilis, and Willardi meridionalis, which are down in Mexico. I think recently Dave Barker proposed elevating all of those to species level. I think most workers are still recognizing these as subspecies.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get into their ecology, but I'm assuming, and the little bit I know about them, the ecology amongst these species is very similar. That one of the major differences is, how they physically look. And so and correct me if I'm wrong there, but the New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnake, how does that look, say, as compared to the other subspecies that you're talking about?
I think most people regard them as drab comparatively because the other subspecies are all sort of I'm a little bit red-green colorblind, so it's hard for me to know how they look to people that have normal color appreciation. But all four other subspecies are sort of a reddish brown chocolate margins on these dorsal blotches, and they've got white crossbars. They have vibrant flash marks on the side of the face. Obscurus is different in that it's most of the time it's pretty solid gray. So just different hues of gray to, from dark gray to very light gray in the pattern, and then an absence of those flash marks on the side of the face. So it's noticeably different from the other four subspecies.
And the other four look more similar to one another than the New Mexican. Would you say that, or they also look quite different from one another?
I think they look more similar to each other than they do to the Obscurus.
Yeah.
Mainly because they all have, fairly vibrant coloration. And, there's differences, in the number of bars on the back and things like that. But, and in the markings on the side of the face and under the chin as well. So there are differences among them, but those differences aren't as dramatic as the differences from Obscurus.
Gotcha. Well, if you talk about their distribution, you gave off some mountain ranges. I mean, the first thing I'd say is you're obviously not giving anything away. Anybody can do a quick Google search and everybody knows where these animals are in a coarse sense. But, if you're talking about some of those mountain ranges and you're talking about the Arizona versus the New Mexico subspecies, the Pelencinos part of the Pelencinos are in Arizona, correct? Good chunk of them. Do I have that right?
They're on the Arizona New Mexico border. Yeah. So we did document the first Obscurus in Arizona in the Pelencios.
Oh, okay, great. Well, and so what I'm getting at is that these mountain ranges you're talking about within the distribution of the species group overall, they're actually not that far apart geographically to have species that are so different, or subspecies that are so different. And so maybe you could just kind of elaborate on what is it about this species and how they distribute on the landscape that where they can be in such close proximity but be so isolated from one another.
So that isolation is because these snakes occupy mountain ranges. And so they're in basically the top of the oak belt up in these mountains. And they've been isolated from one another for even adjacent ranges like willardi from the Huachucas to, the whetstones. Those have probably been isolated for 10 to 20,000 years. And so they're evolving independently right now. Who knows what the future holds for them. But yeah, that's quite a bit of isolation. I doubt that there's been any movement of genes between those mountain ranges for that long. I think, there's a big gap in distribution between the ranges that are occupied by willardi in Arizona and the ranges that are occupied by willardi obscurus over in New Mexico. There's mountain ranges in between that have no willardi in them. The Chiricahuas and the Mule Mountains have no willardi. It's just kind of a mystery to everybody. The Chiricahuas has twin spots. It has lepidus. It has, a lot of other species. And you might predict that they'd be there. There's suitable habitat there, but they're absent. And so I think, these animals colonize those regions coming up out of Mexico. And so that there's probably an even much deeper divide between obscurus and willardi than there is between willardi on adjacent mountain ranges over in Arizona. And in general, obscurus is in drier ranges. And so, I don't have a good hypothesis for why the major coloration difference, except, they've been evolving independently for a while longer, and those ranges are generally a little bit drier than the ranges that you find willardi in.
Yeah, interesting. Snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. If you like what we've been discussing here on the Snake Talk podcast, here's an opportunity to turn that inspiration into action. Head over to www.orian.org and explore how you can support the Orian Society. Click on Take Action on our menu to make a difference. So you mentioned as one of the most important parts of their distribution is this elevation gradient, and it's basically this kind of like oak zone up in elevation. So do we know much about what it is that limits them from going to lower elevations, from connecting some of these mountain ranges? Obviously, in this area, there's incredible diversity of rattlesnakes, and many of them, live in those lower regions. Some of them, actually live in the lower regions and up into the mountains. So, do we know what it is about their biology that limits them to those higher elevations?
No, we don't. We know what elevations they're limited to in different ranges pretty well, but why they're limited, I don't know. Is it physiological? Is it ecological? Has it got something to do with prey species and adaptations associated with foraging for particular kinds of prey? I can't answer that. We are trying to do some predictive habitat modeling with Rich Inman of USGS, and that might offer us some insights to that question. But as of right now, no, I don't know.
Okay. Well, we started at the distribution, and then we kind of fine-tuned that a little bit, talking about elevation, the Sky Islands, and the isolation. Let's get even a little bit finer with that now. And with the Obscurus, let's talk about within those mountain ranges, what are kind of the preferred habitats for this species? Things I've read is that people have a kind of a narrow view of what their habitat is, but that it's actually they can use a more broader suite of habitats. And I may be wrong there, but I'm just curious, kind of within these mountain ranges, what are the types of habitats that these animals need to survive?
So Obscurus is found in 3 mountain ranges. And again, like you said, this is information that's out there and available on the web. I'm not giving anything away here, but in the Sierra San Luis, just to give you some context, it takes about 1 to 2 person days to capture an Obscurus. Okay. So they're fairly abundant down there. In the Animas Mountains, when we started studying them there in the early 1990s, it took about 3 person days to capture an Obscurus. We're up to 5 person days 30 years later. So we think based on that and other data that they are declining there. The Peloncillo Mountains in the early 90s, when we studied them there, it took about 32 person days to capture an Obscurus in the Peloncillo Mountains. We're up to over 100 person days per Obscurus in the Peloncillos now. They're still there. They were seen last year. But think about that. That's 100 person days. That's dedication. And there's even some, avocational herpetologists that have gone down there and put that kind of time in and to actually find one. And so it's not, there's some independent measures, for some of these estimates. It's not just my team. It's other folks that are going down there also. So that gives you an idea of densities and abundance, I guess, in the 3 mountain ranges. The other thing you asked about habitat. Habitat depends on mountain range. So I haven't done as much work in the San Luis, but they get down to even 5,000 feet there. They're more abundant at higher elevations there. In the Animas, we've never captured one below 7,000 feet. And every year for 30 years, we camp at 58,000 or something like that. And we hike through that habitat to get to Obscurus habitat. And so we have, hundreds of thousands of hours of searching in that habitat and walking through that habitat. And we have never found one below 7,000 feet. I don't know why they don't go down there. You look at that habitat, especially, the riparian corridor, along like the canyon bottoms. It looks great, from a herpetologist's eye, it looks like, oh, they ought to be here. But they're not. not from an obscurus's eye. It apparently doesn't look great. It's interesting because right next door in the Peloncillo Mountains, we get them down to 5,000 feet. They're not very abundant, but we found them as low as 5,000 feet. In fact, in 2017, we found one, and it was 1 foot away from a coral snake, which is just a bizarre, association, a coral snake and a New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnake sitting a foot apart. So that gives you some idea elevationally of where they're found in terms of habitat. Peloncillos is a lower, drier mountain range. There's pine oak stringers in the canyon bottoms, and we generally find them associated with that habitat, but occasionally we find them up on grassy plateaus and rocky outcrops and stuff like that as well. In general, the most, nearby woodlands appear to be very important to this species, or at least a history of well-developed woodlands on a mountain appears to be very important. It may not be present now because of the effects of climate change and fire and whatever else, but you don't find them in places where there's not a history of that woodland development. And they're associated with talus slides, generally the edges of talus. We find them in chaparral, thick New Mexico locust, all over these steep, 45-degree slopes. They like bunch grasses on steep slopes above some of these canyons, especially east-facing slopes. I'd say east and north-facing slopes tend to be best. But a lot down in sort of these Mesic canyon bottoms under alligator bark junipers and silverleaf oak and things like that.
Yeah. And so do we know much about how much the species moves within those habitats? Say compared to some other species of rattlesnakes, are they moving long distances, relatively short distances, any kind of interesting like elevational or maybe like mesixeric type movements? How do their movements look throughout the year?
So pretty small home range sizes, a few hectares at best, and short movements in general. I mean, occasionally you'll get like a 60-meter movement or something like that, but they tend to stay in a pretty tight little neighborhood. Compare that. We did radio telemetry on Animus in the 1990s, and so that's what this is based on. At that same time, we also popped a couple transmitters just on a lark into a couple black-tailed rattlesnakes. And the difference is stunning. We had a female black-tailed rattlesnake that went from 7,200 feet up to almost 8,000 feet, turned around, came back down, went past 72, down to about 6, and, covered miles. Yeah. And that was a female, and she did that in 2 months. And so that was in the same habitat, Yeah. And so that's they were
the species I was thinking of when I was talking about rattlesnakes that cover this wide range of elevations. Yeah. So great to hear that you saw that as well. So, but anyways, so the Obscurus, the relatively small home ranges. Any interesting associations with maybe how they use habitats at different times of the year relative to whatever moisture, elevation, rock, grass? Anything noticed in that regard?
Well, females tended to use drier, I think, sunnier slopes. We had a sort of a southeast facing slope we called maternity slope that we had a lot of our pregnant females occupy. And other than that, I didn't notice any seasonal shifts in habitat use. But in terms of activity, there's, a big change. During June, late May, June, I mean, these snakes spend most of their time, at least during the day, underground. And movement is not, they're not making movements as frequently or as far during that time of year. Once the monsoons hit, boom, they are above ground diurnally and they start moving around quite a bit. And then there's a little bit of a lull and then sort of a peak in diurnal surface activity in late September, early October, which is when we focus our annual mark recapture effort.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And just as an anecdote, when one year, one of the first years we were down there in the early 1990s, we came in on like June 15th, and I had a team of 5 people living on the mountain up on this plateau on the north face of Animas. And the we spent 3 weeks and we got one snake. And then the first monsoon rain hit. And the next day, the snakes just were coming into the tent left and right. I couldn't keep up with the processing, And so I think, we talked a little bit earlier about what limits their distribution elevationally. And I think some of it's physiology. My guess is that when people start looking at this, they're going to find them to be a fairly porous snake, if you will, and that they don't have a lot of tolerance for water loss compared to maybe other species of rattlesnakes. At least that this behavior of, you can find Lepidus in June, you can't find Willardi in June. And so that kind of makes me think maybe, water's part of the equation there. Certainly the higher up you go, the more humid the microclimates are, et cetera. So.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about the concept that they live in a monsoonal type climate. And that has my mind kind of spinning and thinking about just things I know about their reproduction and diet and so on. But let's talk about diet at first. So I'm assuming, well, first of all, why don't you just kind of talk generally about, what these rattlesnakes eat. But I am very interested, I'm assuming one of the reasons that you see a lot of them during the monsoon season relates to diet. So maybe if you could touch on that as well.
Sure. So diet is, when they're young, there's a big ontogenetic change in diet. When they're young, they're eating mostly scolopendra centipedes and lizards. And then as about the time they reach reproductive maturity at about 400 millimeters snout vent length or so, they shift. And I don't know that it's, I think it's just gape limited, right? It's not hormonally mediated or anything like that. But there is this shift, and they go to primarily rodents and pick up the odd bird, and every once in a while they'll eat a lizard. So that's their diet. And most of that lizard diet is Scalopris yarvi. It depends on where they are. The ones in the Palancios that were studied by Kirk Setzer ate more diversity of lizards than the ones that we studied up in the Animas. And by the way, the diet information is based partly on museum specimens that I examined, and it's also based on poops that I squeezed out of snakes in the field. And, we identified prey remains, scales, feathers, hair, things like that under a microscope. And so, and they eat a lot of brush mice, Peromyscus boylii, in the Animas, at least as adults. Occasionally they eat pocket gophers. One of the things that was kind of cool that we observed down there that we actually published as a little note is we had a pair of spotted owls that lived on the Animas one summer, actually several summers. But one of our telemetered snakes disappeared on us. And we ended up finding a section of its body below a spotted owl roost. And the transmitter was in that section. The rest of it had been consumed. And the section that was left was the midsection. And inside that midsection was a state endangered southern pocket gopher remains. So we had this endangered thing, right? You got the spotted owls, which are listed, the snakes listed, and at least state listed for the gopher. It was kind of interesting.
That's great. And we haven't mentioned that yet. And we've been talking a lot about locations and habitat and how it's all over the internet. But that's the other important point to make to the audience, that this is a federally listed species, and it's not legal for people to be going out and catching them and handling them or doing anything. So that's just important to mention. We'll talk a little bit about their status later, but
it is.
So with this diet that's kind of shift as they grow, well, actually one thing first, it's more morphology, but I've read it. I want to say I've read it, but I've read that the young Rhiginus rattlesnakes, some of them have like a colored tail, almost like an Echistrodon, like a copperhead or something. And I would assume that that's used for some form of like caudal luring potentially.
Caudal luring.
Yeah. I mean, could you speak to that? Is that something that happens all the time? Do we know if they use it for feeding? How does it work with these other, say centipedes and things they might eat when they're young?
Right. I suspect it's more related to lizards. We had a pregnant female that we captured in the Palancios in the 90s and brought her into camp. And she unfortunately gave birth in captivity before we could release her the next day. And that litter of snakes there's actually a picture of this in Snakes of Arizona. Were polymorphic in terms of their tail colors. Some of them had yellow tails, and then some of them had just jet black tails, and some of them were just striped gray and black. And that's another interesting thing about this snake is it's got a striped tail on this rattlesnake. Not rings, not bands like other, like an atrox, right? But striped, and that's pretty unusual. So they were polymorphic. This litter was polymorphic. We got pictures of that. I don't know that anybody has observed caudal luring in the species, but I can only imagine that it's related to that, and maybe it's an ancestral trait. And I don't know.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah,
but I suspect it's for lizards, if anything. You'd asked earlier, and I forgot to address it, but the monsoons and how it ties into diet. I think it's particularly important for the reproductive biology and the foraging ecology of these snakes with regard to the juveniles, because they're eating lizards and they can't eat big lizards. They got to eat baby lizards. And all of those Scaloporus down there, they either lay their eggs or they give birth at the onset of the monsoon season. And so onset of monsoon, boom, there is all of a sudden the environment is flush with prey for the babies. Humidity goes up, and this is a tiny little snake with a, just surface area to volume ratio is a big problem, I think, for those neonates, and probably dramatically affects survivorship. And so, it's more humid. The prey is available. I think that monsoon figures very prominently into their life history and natural history.
Ah, okay. Yeah, it's interesting. So, obviously with the food, as you just talked about, and then, so in terms of reproduction, they follow a number of other rattlesnake species that kind of have a pattern where there's like a late summer, let's say early fall, whatever you want to call it, breeding season. And that's also the birthing season, where your average female she's not breeding and, giving birth to that male's offspring in that same year. How does that, so the young, like you were just saying, the young are born in that monsoon season where there's a lot of food. So that times up really well. How about the breeding itself? I guess, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. So stop me and actually tell me what the truth is. But it makes sense that the breeding as well would, if they have issues with, say, dry and, it's a good time for them to be on the surface, say males looking for females or whatever it might be. But
right. Yeah.
So,
I think, humidity is higher and so, there's less cost to mate searching and, to females being up and accessible to males. It's basically onset of monsoon. So early July until about mid-August is when the peak of our observations, and this is for willardi, and willardi obscurus, when we have the sort of a peak of observations of copulations and courtship in the wild.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Interesting. And they're, they obviously, so they're not, females aren't giving birth every year. Do we know how long it takes a female to reach sexual maturity? Is it a size thing? Is it an age thing?
Yeah, based on histology, it looks like it's right around, for both males and females, it's right around 400 millimeter snout vent length. So that's, probably third, fourth year, I'd guess. And females, we have seen females give birth in consecutive years in the wild, but we've also seen them skip 2 summers of opportunities for reproduction between, births. And some of that data is based on observations from John Porter, who has been studying willardi in Arizona for 40 years. And he's kind of like he takes a completely different approach than we do. We're down there with pit tags, we're scientists and it's numbers and, and he's kind of more like the Jane Goodall of rattlesnake biology. He's
living with
he just
them.
loves snakes and he lives with them. Yeah. He walks in there. He knows them by pattern. He doesn't pit tag snakes. He knows where their haunts are, where to go find them. He recognizes individuals and can track them, from year to year. Drawings of every snake and its pattern. It's amazing. So some of that data comes from John Porter and not from our study.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's great. Well, let's talk a little bit. I mean, I'm sure we've touched on a number of things we've been talking about, just talking about their ecology and natural history come from your years of studying this animal. But let's talk a little bit more about some of the specific research you've done over the years. And then I want to touch on kind of their status, which we've also talked a little bit about, and then kind of, what's being done about that. But first, just some of the research that you've done. You talked about, I guess we could start with your dissertation. You talked about, they were a big focus of your dissertation. What were some of the things that you were studying with this animal during that time? Whether you're passionate about preserving biodiversity, ensuring the survival of threatened species, or simply want to contribute to a healthier planet, there's a role for you. Your support isn't just a contribution, it's an investment in a future where our ecosystems thrive. Go to www.orian.org to donate or become a member today.
So I was interested. I started telemetry, didn't have any springtime data. In Larry Camise, who's a partner with me on a current Recovery Challenge Award, which I'll talk about later, ended up getting his master's at UTEP by going out there and getting the spring telemetry data. And so that's in his master's thesis. So telemetry was something I kind of started on in that dissertation, but didn't finish up. Larry finished it up. I was interested in natural history, so did the diet studies that we talked about earlier, reproductive studies based on observations in the field, and then also histology. I collaborated with Steve Goldberg at Whittier College on that part of the project. We looked at an awful lot of museum specimens for that. And then I think, sort of one of the central things in my dissertation was looking at conservation genetics and trying to get a handle on, population structure for this subspecies. So we went in and I used microsatellite markers, microsatellite DNA, and we went down to the Palancios and down to the San Luis and collected some animals from the San Luis. We spent 3 years, I think, in the Palancios trying to get a sample size large enough for this analysis. Took us 3 years. We got 18 samples, which is insanity. I mean, field teams down there for 3 years, 18 snakes.
Yeah.
Now, you couldn't do that today. I mean, they're just so much rarer today. And then a lot of time in the Animus, sampling from both two canyons there. I don't want to get too specific, but two of the canyons in the Animus. And, what we found is that the mountains populations have been, isolated from one another for, 10 to, 15 plus thousand years. There's no current gene exchange between those mountain ranges. However, in the Animus, two adjacent canyons, we couldn't find any statistically significant differences in allele frequencies between adjacent canyons, which suggest tremendous amounts of gene flow, right? That animals are moving back and forth. But what's interesting is 30 years of mark recapture data, we've never recaptured an animal that was marked in one canyon in the adjacent canyon, right? So if you were using just, traditional field techniques to assess, what's going on between adjacent canyons, you might conclude that, they were somewhat isolated from one another, but the genes tell a very different story, that at least genes are moving back and forth.
Yeah.
So
with the Great Basin rattlesnakes, this is a little aside, but we had different populations, and we found an interesting pattern. Of course, these animals move much further than the ones you're working with, where kind of their main areas, home ranges, and overwintering sites and all of that would have been separate, showed a lot of gene flow, but animals weren't actually moving. But because the breeding season was away from these places, that males and females were coming together miles away from what we think of as their core, breeding and then sending those genes back. But anyways, and then it is fascinating though that you don't see that movement amongst canyons. But I wonder how often that would have to happen to actually see the gene flow patterns you're seeing. It's interesting.
One migrant per generation.
Yeah. There you go.
One migrant per generation, and we'll do it, which is really low. The telemetry data also showed us that, individuals aren't, at least regularly moving between those canyons, because none of our telemetered animals, including some big males, stayed in the canyons that they were captured in. So both the mark recaptured, the telemetry data, suggest this, small home range size, a lot of phylopatry. But I don't know, maybe every once in a while a juvenile disperses, or they're just contiguous enough that there's gene flow through individuals rather than individuals actually moving.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting. So that was one of the big focus areas for your dissertation. I'm sure we'll come back to that when we talk a little bit about status and conservation. But what since between now and then, you mentioned mark recapture, and it sounds like you've been going out to some of these sites for a long time. So what are some of the other kind of major research questions or projects that you've been working on in these populations?
With Willardi in particular?
Your Obscurus, or ridge-nosed rattlesnakes in general. Yeah.
So I think for 30 years we've gone down, and when I say we, I'm talking about a core group of folks, of herpetologists from New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, and we go down there every October and conduct the mark recapture work, and it really is a team effort. It's anywhere from 20 to 25 people each year, and we're down there for 10 days. And it's a lot of fun. It's folks that have had 30 years of field experience together. You can imagine what that's like. And but all of that has been kind of basic natural life history, genetic work, sort of the science of it. And I think we've identified threats to the species. But what's exciting is that now we're actually starting to think about a road forward in recovery. One of the things we found with my genetic work from back in the 90s is that the Cirrus on Luis that population's incredibly genetically diverse, very high heterozygosity. All the measures of genetic diversity are high in that population. They're also reasonably high in the Animus population, and they are absolutely in the basement in the Palencios. It is a genetically depauperate population, which you might expect just based on the population size, right? So we have these multiple lines of evidence that Palencios is in big trouble. So why is that? Well, the natural drying, heating cycle that's been going on for 10,000 years has been really exacerbated, I think, by man. And so, anthropogenic climate change, I think, is the biggest threat to this species. For whatever reason, they're adapted to these mesic, higher elevation, habitats that are, at least have woodland as a component, right? And, or adjacent woodland as a component. Palencios, they get to just a little over 6,000 feet. I think Obscurus was in trouble in the Palencios, before climate change, and climate change has, just made it orders of magnitude worse for them there. And so, when I got to the Animus in 1994, Charlie Painter, who is the one who brought me into this work, would tell tales of the main creek there flowing, during most of the year, that there were Chiricahua leopard frogs up in that mountain range, and they're not there. I've never seen a Chiricahua leopard frog there.
Do you see the water flow much, or is it usually pretty dry?
Depends on the year. Depends on the year. And when it flows, it's usually, unless there's been a really recent monsoon storm, it's intermittent stretches of flow and low flow. And so it's changed, from when Charlie was going there in the 70s. It had changed by the time I came on the scene in 1994. And since then, it's changed dramatically. There's been a series of fires, and the recovery from those fires isn't what it used to be because of climate change. I think those fires are behaving a little bit more differently. There's not a strong history of fire suppression in that range. So, as there is like in the adjacent Palencia Mountains, which are national forest. Animus are privately owned, and that's something I should mention. We've been able to visit there only through the good graces of the Animus Foundation, which owns the mountain. And visitation is strictly controlled by them. So that's another important point to bring up, as well as the conservation status.
So you mentioned climate change and the concept of, it's, temperatures, I'm assuming, are getting warmer. I'm assuming precipitation is changing. Sounds like it's getting drier. Those oak forests, are probably moving over long time periods, but faster than they would have, or moving up these mountains. And so the snakes are also having to move up the mountain. So it's interesting to think about potential conservation strategies when you think about genetics and these different mountain ranges, different top elevations. And I want to get into some of that in a minute, kind of like what does the future hold? But before we do that, what are some of the other major threats? I mean, I would think with a species like this, that the human factor, even though this subspecies is federally listed, that they're just a small, very beautiful snake, and that human pressure, whether that's collection or maybe even just intense field enthusiasts, handling a lot of animals or looking for animals in disturbing habitats. I mean, how much of a factor do you think that is in the whole kind of conservation status of this species?
Well, so they were listed because that was the perceived threat to the subspecies. They were discovered in the Animus Mountains, and Caulfield wrote about that, and that inspired, lots and lots of people to go down there. There's reports of going into Animus, and finding in the main canyon there, finding just 15 cars parked there, and everybody there was going to look for Obscurus. And some of them were not going there to just check them off a list, right? Mm-hmm. And so the listing by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was, I think, because of the perception that collection could dramatically impact that population. They weren't talking about climate change at that point. Now, since that time, that was a ranch at the time, and since that time, the land was bought by the Nature Conservancy and then sold to the Animus Foundation, and access is strictly controlled. I mean, I've heard stories of people being arrested by the Hidalgo County Sheriff for trying to get in there. So at least with regard to the Animus population, I think collecting really isn't a threat because of the land ownership, right? It's not national forest. There's not public access. Do people sneak in there? I'm sure they do. How much damage can they do? It's a lot of effort to sneak in there. So I don't think that is a primary threat to the Animus. I think it's a small enough population that if there was open access, it could be a threat. San Luis, I know people go down there. It's illegal to collect them there and import them. It still happens. But that is such an enormous population that I doubt that it impacts the overall trajectory of that population. The Palencios is a different story. The Palencios does get a lot of folks looking for them because it's the only place on public land in the United States you can search for them. I think you have to be a masochist to go down there and look for Obscurus in the Palencio Mountains, but people do it, and some of them get lucky. I testified in a trial where some guys went down there, and their first weekend down there, 5 of them, and they caught one, and then were silly enough to brag about it and show it to some U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agents, and they went to trial. And so folks do go down there and get lucky, but you got to remember that there were 15 other groups that went down there looking with 5 people, and they didn't get anything. And so the number of person days per snake still holds true. I think that population is on the precipice, and removal of individual animals from it is a profound threat.
Yeah. And I'm assuming there's a lot of flipping involved for people looking for this animal. So even if they're not finding an animal, I mean, do you see a lot of, if it's getting that kind of pressure, if this is a box that people want to tick or collect, I mean, do you see a lot of damage to rock areas, important, like kind of microhabitats, or is that not such a big issue in the Palencios?
We see some, but it's mainly near the only public road that transects that mountain range. Most of those folks that have those kind of unethical searching practices tend not to wander too far from roads. I don't know why. There's a correlation there, but that's what I found. Or maybe there's just a lot more people that close, and so that's where you see that activity. The really funny thing is that flipping's not going to help you find one.
Yep.
It's not going to increase your odds. You're going to spend, so much more time, flipping rocks than you could have spent walking around and getting buzzed. And, we've found, we have done some flipping in the early days, but we don't flip for Obscurus anymore. It's just not a productive strategy. And it's, you're ruining microhabitat.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like by far the most important threat for these species is the kind of changing climate and changing forests and precipitation and all of that. And
fire.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Let's talk about that for a minute. I'm curious how the natural fire regimes are changing, which is obviously, I'm assuming, linked to climate there. But yeah, how is fire changing the landscape?
So there's quite a bit of data out of the tree ring lab down at University of Arizona. Tom Sweatnam and Chris Bassan have done, the early work on that. And they've got, tree ring data from Animas. I think there's some from the Palencios, but, a lot of those Sky Islands down there. And, historically, there were these big sweeping fires that would start out in the grasslands, and they would come up the flanks of the mountains and burn up into the mountains. And they did that every 5 to 10 years. And so they would, they would take out a lot of the smaller trees, and they'd take out a lot of the ladder fuels and things like that, and maintain sort of these more open, woodlands up in there, and, these pine oak stringers down in the canyon bottoms. And then we had, fire suppression, I think, for over a century, primarily, active fire suppression by the Forest Service, Smokey the Bear stuff. But then also, overgrazing. It's hard to get fire to travel up into those mountains on a regular basis when, you've got, cows eating up all the forage out there. And so, fire frequency went way down, and I think ladder fuels built up and stand structure has changed over the years. And so now when fire gets in there, it behaves in a different manner, and it takes out a lot of the trees, and it takes out a lot of the woodland. And I think that, Peromyscus boylei, one of the things they eat is a highly arboreal little deer mouse, right? Mm-hmm. And spends a lot of time in trees. And we see our snakes, at the base of trees and hunting postures and along down logs and things like that, looking for these rodents. I think there's just so much of their ecology that's tied to that, mesic forest habitat. And that if we get rid of it all, they're going to have a hard time persisting there. We're going to create great lepidus habitat and, pretty poor willardite habitat overall. And I think, so there's this history that's changed the structure of the forest and the amount of fuels that are available and things like that. And so fire's getting in there and behaving, in a way that it did not historically. But then there's also the fact that, this climate change is making it a lot tougher for forests to recover from that. And certainly some of the trees down there, like Chihuahua pines and everything, they require that fire to regenerate. They're adapted for that. But there's other forest elements down there that's not true for. The Animus goes up, it's got Douglas fir, it's got aspens, it's got, Mexican white pine at the highest elevations, and it's disappearing. I mean, giant ponderosa or Doug firs up there, and they're just gone.
Wow. Huh. And you'd find these snakes all the way up into some of those habitats.
Oh yeah, up to the top of Animus. Yeah, on the peak. One of the largest obscures ever found was found on the peak.
Yeah.
That's kind of specific, but
Yeah. So
it's
basically,
protected.
the fires have become over time. They become less frequent, but when they do hit, much more intense.
Yes.
Then impacting the overall forest more. And then, as you mentioned, with changing climate, warmer, maybe less precipitation, then these forests are having a more difficult time recovering. And so you're almost, your ecosystem's kind of going through almost like a transition to something else um, that the snakes
Right.
didn't evolve to. So interesting.
Right. Right. We want fire because fire is part of that system. But I think we got to be very careful about getting fire back into that landscape. And so that's one of the big management discussions that we have with, the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera. And there's talk now about trying to maybe do some mechanical removals and things like that. So,
yeah. Well, that's where I wanted to go. Kind of last point before we wrap up here is just talk about what the future holds. We talk about this kind of like climate, precipitation, temperature, natural disturbance regime issue. We've talked about the isolated nature of the snakes and how they're limited. Like, what does the future hold? You talked a little bit about being maybe more strategic with management, whether that be mechanical removal and prescribed fire, whatever it might be. What are some of the things that are coming down the road in terms of conservation for the species?
So, like I said, I think this is an exciting time, at least for me, because we're actually talking about recovery. And, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has recently become, in terms of policy, much more amenable to the concept of assisted migration in the face of climate change. And so our Recovery Challenge Award indirectly addresses some of the foundations that are going to be necessary for assisted migration down the road when we are ready to start considering that. We're trying to set the stage for that by, first of all, working, like I said, with Rich Inman at USGS and trying to develop some predictive habitat models that take climate change into consideration. Where is habitat going to be in the United States for this species in 2100? Because it's not probably going to be in the Palencios, and it's not probably going to be in the Animus. And so where might it be? Where could we move these snakes to where they could persist and continue to evolve? And, assisted migration is controversial for some folks. Monkeying around with evolution, playing God with evolution was something that at the start of my PhD was sort of anathema to me. But as the decades have ticked by and I've watched what's happened to this population, it's like, all right, we're already screwing with the system. At least let's try and screw with it in a good way, maybe. I think you want to proceed with caution whenever you do things like this, but it's something I'm very open to at this point. So let's identify some places that we can take these animals. Let's start thinking about captive breeding and trying to produce progeny in captivity. Let's think about translocation and how it's going to work best. Moving animals into new habitats, what age classes, et cetera, and what times of year and things like that. Think about genetic augmentation of the Palencios, which I think is a prayer, but, I think it's worth a shot. No harm. I don't think any harm can come from it. So habitat modeling, we're going down this monsoon season to the San Luis, and part of that Recovery Challenge Award is we're going to collect 42 rattlesnakes down there and import them into the United States. The last of our permits just came in a couple weeks ago, so we're all set. 30 of those snakes will go to 3 zoos: San Antonio Zoo, Arizona Sonora Desert Museum, and LA Zoo. And 10 each, 5 males, 5 females. And we're just, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's help, encouraging them to just start experimenting with captive breeding and finding out how to maximize captive production of progeny. Something that's totally outside my wheelhouse. I'm really excited to have these expert partners on board. But historically, Obscurus hasn't done well in captivity. I mean, people have produced progeny, but it's been a little bit of a problematic snake, so it's going to probably take a little bit to work out some of the kinks. So that's 30 of the snakes. 12 of them, young of the year, we're going to take into the Palancios and release them there to genetically augment that population. I think, part of the problem for the Palancios might be a lack of adaptive genetic variation. And so, certainly part of the problem is it's this poor habitat overall. It's a sinking Sky Island, right? But part of the problem might be this lack of genetic variation. And so these things are incredibly abundant in the Sierra San Luis. There's incredible genetic diversity down there. 12 animals leaving the San Luis is not going to put a dent in that population, especially young animals, most of which are going to die anyway, right? They just have incredible juvenile mortality. So if we get those animals up into the Palancios and even one of them grows up and breeds, that's success. Mm-hmm. We've moved genes from the Palancios or from the San Luis into the Palancios. And so I think it's worth a shot. I don't think there's a possibility of any harm there. And we've carefully considered that from genetic perspectives and disease transmission perspectives and all kinds of things like that. But, our chances of success, is that going to save the population? I have low hope for that. But it's just one of those actions that doesn't take a lot of effort, and it could help. It could make a difference.
Interesting. Well, I love hearing the assisted migration approach. Like I said, it might be fairly controversial, but I think thinking like this, especially for species, in a system like Sky Island, species that aren't that mobile, I think this is, I know it's already becoming more and more common for people to think about, given what we're seeing happen with climate. So that's great. Well, before we wrap this up, is there anything else you wanted to mention about ridge-nosed rattlesnakes? Anything we missed that you think was really critical?
Well, obviously, early on I said that, I think a lot of people think Obscurus is drab. I see these comments on the internet, and I think these people are out of their minds. This is the most beautiful of all the willardized subspecies. It's the most elegant rattlesnake on the planet. They are. They're just like these lithe, relatively thin, graceful snakes, and they're not flashy like those willardi. They just look like flashy snakes to me, And this is a beautiful little snake. Yeah, subdued colors and yeah. But I'm biased.
Yeah. Love it. I've never seen one in the wild. So, but anyways, great. Well,
yeah.
I like to, let's imagine that we are out maybe in one of these mountain ranges and we're doing some mark recapture work on these snakes, and we get back to camp and we're sitting around the campfire at night having a beverage or cigar or whatever it might be, and we are and then I turn to you and I ask you to tell me your best snake story.
Well, there's a lot. I guess two come to mind. One was the day that I found Lepidus, willardi, molossus, and pyromilana all in the same day on Animus. And that was just, I was pretty excited that day. But probably my most memorable snake hunting memory is also on Animus. And we had, there was a giant Masticophis bilineatus and whip snake, and it just went right up into this oak tree, and it was a short oak tree. And so there were about 4 or 5 of us there, and we surrounded that oak, and we were going to get that snake. And it was on the far side of the tree. For me, it got scared over to my side, and it went up onto this branch that was, just above the reach of my hand. But I could pull that branch down. So I reached up and grabbed a piece of it and pulled that branch down, and the snake slid off the branch and into my face and bit my nose, and its lower jaw was lodged inside my nostril. It would not let go, and it was a really hot day. And so my nose was bleeding profusely, and this thing would not unlatch, and I couldn't get it off. And a buddy came over and took a picture of me, and there's literally tears streaming out of my eye, and there's blood all over my nose and face. And so that's probably one of my most memorable encounters.
Yeah, I bet that made a great picture. So
it was wonderful, embarrassing, but wonderful. I'd also like to mention that our recovery challenge work that we're doing right now with ridge-nosed rattlesnakes is through the Rattlesnake Conservancy. And Tony Daly Cruz is our partner on that and has been an invaluable asset. And also, I really need to mention the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ecological field office in Ecological Services Field Office in Albuquerque has been a steadfast supporter and a big part of this project also, particularly Clint Smith, the biologist that oversees ridge-nosed rattlesnakes.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Andy, for joining us today and for all the work you're doing to try to recover this important and interesting species.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful visiting with you.
Great. And I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.